All right, welcome everybody. My name is Romeo, Romeo Valentin. I'm a PhD student with the Stanford Intelligent Systems Lab with Michael Kogendorfer. And today we're going to present a paper that we recently published to Dask 2024 on probabilistic pose estimation from image features. So today's talk is really going to be interesting for anybody who does state estimation, or in particular pose estimation, given measurements under uncertainty of any kind. It's going to be interesting to people who do any type of image processing in that state, getting your parameters, getting your state from image features, let's say. And in particular, this talk is going to be interesting to anybody, any of you who say, I love the Kalman filter. And so how can we really take estimates from different types of uncertainties and make them such that we can feed them in the highest quality way to the Kalman filter and get nice, well-calibrated and sharp results? We're going to talk about what that means. And so before we get started, I quickly want to thank my collaborators. So my collaborators in particular, Sydney and June, collaborators from my lab. Of course, my professor, Michael Kogendorfer, and then my contacts at Airbus A Cubed, Don Walker and Matt Sorgenfrey. So thank you to all of you. And so to get started, we want to talk a little bit about the problem that we're going to face today. So let's imagine we want to solve a kind of post estimation application, in particular for this autonomous runway landing application. So in this scenario, we're sitting inside of the runway, inside of the airplane, sorry, and we have a camera. And we take a photo of the runway at any given time. And we want to use this photo, which you can see at the lower left, to actually compute our own pose. And so how we typically do this is we say, okay, we know something about the geometry of the real runway because we can just look it up in the database. And so we might know the real locations of these 4 corner points marked in red here. And now all we need to do in some sense is to somehow figure out in the image, okay, where are the 4 corner points in the image? And then knowing the correspondences in the real world, that allows us to actually compute our own pose in the real world. So pose here can be 3 degree of freedom, can be 6 degree of freedom, including rotation. It doesn't really matter. And so the problem is that typically measuring making the measurements in the image space turns out to be quite tricky. So this image that we see here, it's kind of very zoomed in, and you can already see a lot. Typically, you have a much larger image, and the runway, from let's say 2 or 3 or 5 kilometers away, is a very small runway, and you don't see so much. And so what people typically do is they use some kind of computer vision model here. And this might be a machine learning model, or it might not be a machine learning model. We're kind of agnostic to that. And you're going to use your computer vision model to make predictions about where in the image space we can actually find these corner points. So here I've marked 2 corner points. And what we assume for our work is that we say, okay, we don't just make a prediction of the locations of the corner points, which would be maybe a pixel XY kind of measurement. We also make a prediction of the uncertainty, or we make some kind of estimation of the uncertainty in the pixel space, right? So this could, for example, be a Gaussian. It could also be some more complicated distribution. And now our grand question is, how can we turn this uncertainty from the kind of pixel space into an uncertainty in the pose space, right? An uncertainty estimate over our own pose and position, so that we can feed it later to the Kalman filter at any given time step. And so in particular, how can we make sure that this uncertainty estimate about our own pose is kind of the highest quality? Quality here meaning that we're well calibrated and that we're sharp. We're going to talk about this in a moment. So before we go deeper in, let's say a few words on why we actually need to do pose estimation from images in the first place. And you might say, okay, we actually have already many ways to do measurements of our own pose. For example, GPS come to mind, IMU come to mind. Maybe you have another great way to do it. And I just want to spend a few sentences on this. So one important point to notice is that the camera typically is a completely separate system from, for example, GPU from GPS, from IMU. And so when you expect a failure for one of these other systems, for example, because there's a problem in the GPS or in the IMU or something, you would typically not expect that it also relates to a failure in the camera, and vice versa. And so you have these kind of independent, redundant systems. And then you can, for example, say, well, you have a failure analysis, failure probability for the first system, we have failure probability for the second system, and we can kind of multiply them together since they have independent failure modes. Great. So I want to say a few more things about why this is a difficult challenge that we want to solve. So first of all, we are not going to assume that everything is nice and Gaussian. So in particular here, our pixel measurements, they may have a Gaussian kind of error on them, so it might be off by a few pixels to the left or the right. But we find actually in reality that oftentimes the errors in the pixel space, they turn out to be either strongly correlated between different features in the image space, and you might also think about other features such as angles, for example, sightline angles or horizon angle or so. And also we find that often they are not actually Gaussian, but they are, for example, a long tail kind of distribution, where you do find kind of a lot of points in the center, but actually they go out by quite a long margin, kind of a pushy distribution style. And so in these settings, it's oftentimes not easy to kind of process this level of uncertainty and to kind of push it through the different stages of the pipeline. And another thing that we need to solve is that you want to probably run this algorithm online. You want to run it on the airplane or on your machine, on your robot. And so you need to have a fast way of doing it. And so what you will see at the end of this talk is that we have a nice algorithm that we publish and that's openly available, that you can run from any computer that can run C code, because we kind of provide a C library, and that can run at somewhere between 5 Hertz and 500 Hertz, depending on a little bit on the assumptions that you make. Great. So as our first kind of major topic of discussion, let's talk about what makes a good probability distribution. And so if I ask you, have you ever thought about if the kind of uncertainties that you're working with and that you maybe put inside of the Kalman filter, into the Kalman filter, if they're actually representative of kind of the true uncertainty and what does it even mean, the true level of uncertainty? We're somehow talking about error distributions here, but I find that many people have never really thought about what exactly does it mean to assign a certain amount of uncertainty to a measurement, especially for a measurement for which you're only ever going to measure once the ground truth kind of solution. And so we introduce here 2 metrics, which are kind of known in the literature outside of aerodynamics, but I haven't seen it so much applied inside of the kind of robotics context. And this first notion is the idea of calibration, which I already mentioned. So let's consider here these 2 kind of Gaussian distributions. And we have here one time our predictions in red and one time our ground truth measurements in gray. And so I can go ahead and ask you, do you think we're doing a good job with the red kind of, prediction? And so you can think about, you can say, well, it's not so bad in the center, maybe we do a good job, and then we kind of go outside. But it's a very, a little bit hand-wavy description of if we're doing a good job. And so what we want here is to come up with a more kind of numerical or quantifiable way of describing if this is good, then maybe something else is better or worse or something. And so one of the ways to do this in kind of a somewhat rigorous way is to say, all right, let's look at our predictions and let's look at the area that is within 1 standard deviation of the prediction, right? So this would maybe be the dark red kind of oval here. And so maybe in a standard Gaussian, in a 1D Gaussian, you expect about 68% of the samples to fall inside of 1 standard deviation. So here we square it because we're 2-dimensional. So you have about 34. You expect about 34% of the samples in the 1 standard deviation. And now you can see, okay, well, how many samples from the ground truth actually do fall within 1 standard deviation, right? And so you can kind of measure this, and then you get a theoretical value of 34%, and an empirical value, maybe of more or less or something. And then you can do this process again and again. And what you will get is, you will get a whole curve that says, okay, at a theoretical 25% coverage, we actually only observe 20%. At a theoretical 50% coverage, we only observe 45%, and so on. And so you get a kind of calibration curve like this. And so this would be the calibration curve here. And you can have many types of calibration curves. And now you have a way to kind of, put a number to this idea. Okay, do two distributions kind of describe probabilistically a similar thing? And if not, how are they kind of failing? Are they kind of failing already in the middle or only failing at the kind of outskirts of the distribution? And so this is one of the metrics we're going to use. But it turns out this is not enough, and you can actually have well-calibrated measurements. So measurements that describe well the kind of distribution mass or the probability mass, but that are not sharp. And so this is the second important concept that we have to look at. So this is an example of a more sharp and a less sharp prediction. And sharpness really just means kind of how wide is the standard deviation, right? And you can see the blue prediction, it's quite narrow, it's quite sharp, we would say. And the red prediction, it's quite wide and it's less sharp. And so it turns out, as I said, that you can have well-calibrated but not sharp measurements and vice versa. And so ultimately, we're interested in both calibrated and sharp results. And we can measure this at every stage of our pipeline. So we can go into the pixel space, we can go into the post space, and we can also go into what comes out of the filtering after the common filter has been applied and look at these uncertainty estimates and see if they're calibrated and sharp. Great. And for sharpness, just one last thing is that we will plot it later in this kind of way, where for any given sample, so for one particular prediction, we're going to see, what is the standard deviation for the sample in meters, for example. We're just going to, make one dot, and then we can compute a box plot over many different predictions, and we'll get a plot like this. Will become important in a second. So our first part of the contribution, just to recap here, is to even start thinking about, okay, what is our goal when we say we want a nice description of our probability somehow? How can we measure whether we're doing a good or a bad job? And this is how we will be able to measure it. We look at the calibration curves and we look at the sharpness levels of our prediction at different stages of the pipeline. And then we can, understand if certain methods are doing a good or a bad job. So our second contribution is really now thinking about grade. Now we have these uncertain estimates in the image space, and we want to kind of push them into the pose space, right? And it's not so easy in particular for kind of arbitrary shapes of the uncertainty. And so we introduce these three probabilistic estimators, or three formulations how we can really solve this. I'm not going to spend too much time today on the math. There's more detail in the paper. But just on a high level, there's three ways, and they're not so complicated. So the first one we propose is quite simple, really, and we call it the least squares estimator. So here, you might notice that if we were in a setting where we actually don't have any noise, then we could just solve a least squares kind of minimization problem that finds the pose that most aligns with the different measurements, so that has kind of the least amount of projection error. And so what we can now do is we can look at our predicted noise distribution, and we can just sample noise, let's say 100 times. And for each time we sample noise, we actually solve the entire pose estimation problem, and we get one, pose sample. And then we can do this. It turns out you need to do it about 300 to 500 times. And then you get a nice distribution of possible points. And to this, you can fit, for example, a Gaussian or another distribution. And then you have already solved the problem. So this is a very simple way of doing it. But we're going to see that it can be, although it's easy to implement, it can be a bit slow, and it can also produce not so sharp results in the end. Sorry about that. Another way that we can do, and which turns out to be very computationally efficient, is to say, okay, let's for now just assume everything to be Gaussian. And we can even have some correlations between the different errors in the pixel space, but we assume we know exactly the correlations. And so what we can do then is we can just solve one time the pose estimation problem with no noise, and we'll get a mean. And then we can just get the uncertainty or the covariance matrix by using this, a little bit scary looking matrix equation here, which uses somehow the Jacobian of the projection function, which, it's not too bad, and you can kind of write down the Jacobian, and then you can just take the uncertainty covariance matrix in the pixel space and kind of translate it into the pose space. And so this turns out to be really fast. We'll see in a second how fast. But we'll also see that if you violate this assumption that everything is nice and Gaussian, this method can really break down quite a bit. And finally, we propose a method also that we haven't seen so much used in the robotic space, but is very popular in other types of statistical inference applications, which we call the Markov chain Monte Carlo estimator, or Monte Carlo Markov chain estimator. I will not talk about too much today what is the MCMC estimator, how does it work, but just on a very high level, you can say, okay, in the least squares estimator, we try to kind of sample from our probability distribution by kind of solving the whole problem many times with sampled noise. But it turns out, instead of solving the problem many times, you can also do some, magic math, let's say, and you can sample points directly on the probability density without solving the problem many times. And so this may turn out to be more efficient for our problem. We'll see in a second. Great. So this is really our second contribution, that we say we will now want to solve this problem, turning the probabilities from the image space into the probabilities from the in the pose space, maintaining calibration and getting good sharpness. And so let's see if we can actually do this. So here's a simple simulation study where we now simulate to put our airplane somewhere, and we simulate just a little bit of uncorrelated normal noise in the pixel space. And then we solve this pose estimation problem with all of the estimators as we have seen, and we do it a bunch of times. And then we get a calibration curve on the left, and we get a sharpness distribution on the right for each of the estimators. And here we see that actually all estimators pretty much do the same, same kind of result, and it is looking quite good. The calibration curve is great. The sharpness is exactly the same for all three, which is somewhat interesting. And so I think we can say that all three do, first of all, the best possible job that any algorithm could do, and also they kind of perform the same. But now we can see, if we go into a more complicated setting, things diverge a little bit. So in this scenario, we consider long tail noise. And so that means that in the pixel space, we don't just assume a normal Gaussian, but we assume a model that has kind of errors that flatten out more towards the edges. And already then we can see that the calibration curve of the linear approximation in red on the left, where we assume everything to be nice and Gaussian and linear, kind of breaks down, and the calibration values do not become very convincing anymore. And so we can see, for example, because the red curve lies under the diagonal, we see that at any given theoretical coverage, for example, of 50%, actually only very few samples lie inside of these 50%. So that means that the true uncertainty or the true errors are actually much larger than what our model here predicts. At the same time, the least squares and the MCMC estimators do a quite good job on the calibration front. However, when we look at the sharpness plot, we actually see that the MCMC and the least squares estimators differ quite a bit. And in particular, the MCMC estimator is able to get really good and very sharp results. So what this means is that our pose estimate, while being also well calibrated, is much smaller, much more compact probability distribution than for the least squares estimators. Great, and then we have also run this on some real data. So now this is really kind of closing the loop and taking our pose estimates and feeding them into the Kalman filter and seeing if even after filtering, our results stay calibrated. And this is really the ultimate goal. What does it mean to stay calibrated? Well, at any given moment, the probability distribution before and after filtering really does represent our true error distribution, and it's not some whack approximation that doesn't really hold. And so this is taking a real approach or data from a real approach from our partner at A-Cubed. And we look along one approach at the camera images. We use a machine learning model to extract the corner estimates together with the uncertainties. Then in this case, we use the linear model to push through the uncertainty and get these pose estimates in any time point, put them into the Kalman filter, and then show you the results here. And so first of all, we can see that all three coordinates, altitude, along track, and cross track, stay quite well calibrated, which is really the main part or the main point of our work here. And so that's very nice to see. And at the same time, and we would kind of expect this, we can see that the Kalman filter allows us to become much sharper. So we see kind of the sharpness or the amount of uncertainty as we do the approach, first unfiltered in the dotted line, and then filtered in the solid line. And we can see that we have approximately a 2x improvement. What this means is that maybe we have an uncertainty of, let's say, 400 meters, and then after filtering 200 meters, while staying well calibrated. Great. So that's looking really good. We're planning to put this onto more types of measurements. But an important question is, can you actually run this type of estimators, such as the least squares or the MCMC estimator, that need to sample, let's say, 500 times at any given, for any single estimation? Couldn't you even run these online? Are they fast enough? And so in our timing measurements, we find that the least squares estimator, we call noise sampling, takes about 1/3 of a second for 500, generating 500 samples, so solving the least squares problem 500 times, and then fitting a Gaussian to this. The linear approximation only takes half a millisecond, so you can do this 2,000 times per second. And the MCMC estimator, which actually performed best in many of our experiments, runs in about 200 milliseconds, so at about 5 hertz. And so what we conclude from this is that these algorithms are useful. You can really use them on real data to achieve real results. And they're fast enough to run on a real-time system, maybe at 5 hertz or something adjusted depending on your system. Great. So then just some closing notes. We have code for all of this available. So these estimators are implemented inside of this package called Probabilistic Parameter Estimators. This is basically already a full example of how you can use it. I'm not going to go through it too much right now, but it's 7 lines of code or something. And then we're also able to export this as a C library. So here you can see a little C interface, and you just kind of set up your measurements and you set up your runway geometry. And then in the end, you put it inside of the pose estimator, and you can run it straight with C, which means you can run it on any robot that you can run C code on. And we also have a library for the calibration measurement available. Great. So that concludes our presentation today. And just to recap what we did today, I told you at the end of this talk, you're going to see how we can take estimates under uncertainty and kind of turn them into the highest quality estimate that we can then feed into the Kalman filter. And we were looking at this pose estimation example, and we saw how we can go from uncertainty in the image space to uncertainty in the pose space. And then we figured out that there's different ways to do this, and some of them are definitely better than others. In particular, once we figure out how to measure what is good and what is bad. And so we measured, or we introduced and then measured calibration and sharpness. And we saw that for very Gaussian scenarios where everything is nice and linear, or at least approximately linear, a simple linear approximation estimator does a good job. But once the noise distributions become more complicated, we need something more complicated to solve also. And we find that the MCMC estimator performs best. And then we've also shown that we have real code with this that runs on real examples and on real robots, and that you can grab right now. And so to conclude, I hope that next time you handle your Kalman filter, now you know how to take your measurements and really turn them into the highest quality measurement that you have to feed it to the Kalman filter.